What? Is life? Where did we come from? Water is H2O, 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen, pulled together by covalent bonds. The air we breathe is a mix of countless particles along with dust and water vapor. Then what is it that makes up life? What are the ingredients of our fundamental essence? And what is it that separated us nearly 4 billion years ago and continues to separate us today from everything else? Though no doubt many individuals in the ancient world concern themselves with these great questions, it was the Greeks from around the 7th century BC onwards who turned it into a viable career path. Many philosophers of the Greek world, like Epicurus, Lucretius and Plato, preoccupied themselves with where life came from. The overwhelming conclusion was that life begets life. But what of the first life? What begat that? In the 4th century BC, Aristotle concluded that living things arise spontaneously from non-living matter, as long as that matter contains named pneuma, or vital heat. Worms, he surmised, arose spontaneously from decaying manure. Insects sprang forth from the morning dew, and eels slithered newborn from nothing more than wet ooze and rotting sea. Remarkable as this may seem to us now, Aristotle's ideas of spontaneous generation dominated thinking on the origin of life for nearly 2,000 years. The scientists that followed in his footsteps, devising ever more complex recipes for higher forms of life. Like early 17th century Dutch scientist Jean-Baptiste van Helmont, who reasoned that a dirty shirt left in a bin with wheat germ for 21 days would spontaneously generate live mice. Over time, though, the recipes for spontaneous life lost favour. Science advanced and explanations were found for the seemingly miraculous appearance of animals in old, abandoned heaps of dirt. But for the smaller, enigmatic creatures, bacteria and weird, single-celled amoebas, spontaneous generation proved hard to disprove. Finally, in the 19th century, French biologist Louis Pasteur devised an experiment to exclude any outside influence from a flask full of inanimate matter, a vacuum. When the flask remained sterile, the concept of spontaneous generation was proved to be false. Matter alone could not make life, after all. To this day, no laboratory has been able to pull life from its absence. Frankenstein remains a fiction. Life, and only life, has continued to beget life. And yet, we know today that the Earth formed more than 4 billion years ago without life. No living thing could have survived the convulsions of the Hadean eon. But here we are today, on an Earth brimming with, overflowing with living beings of every imaginable form and function. From rainforest to desert, from the highest peaks to the deepest ocean depths, life thrives. So, it is abundantly clear, at some point between 3 to 4 billion years ago, matter did make life. The final act of spontaneous generation in history, the origin of life on Earth. The questions that remain are how, and from what? The first life on Earth must have been the simplest possible life. No mice could have sprouted spontaneously into being on a late Hadean eon Earth. In order to decipher where life came from, we must first consider what exactly life is at its most basic level. A monumental task requiring all the efforts of modern scientific technique. In most education systems, humans learn to define living things by what they do, animals, plants, and fungi taking steps to maintain themselves, grow, and reproduce. But this isn't the full story. Living creatures might do these things, but they're not the only ones. By this definition, we would class some crystals as being alive, or computer viruses, algorithms even. Today, this is not the standard definition for the origin of organic life on Earth. Instead, we need to zoom in to the microscopic level to see what living things are made of. The simplest forms of life today, bacteria, have two basic ingredients. A self-replicating molecule like DNA that contains the instructions for making another one of itself. And a self-contained metabolism that provides the machinery to do the living and the replicating. Defined like this, we capture the essence of every living thing on planet Earth. Everything is made up of cells, like the bacterial cell, which, at their core, have a self-replicating molecule and a self-sustaining metabolism. This definition gives viruses a place on the road to life too, even if they don't quite qualify. These tiny structures have a self-replicating molecule within them, just like every other living thing. But they lack the machinery to do anything with that molecule. Instead, they must hijack other organisms to borrow the organic factories that will allow them to reproduce. Some scientists would class them as alive. Others would not. Some even think that they may be a piece in the puzzle of life's origins, a kind of halfway point between living and dead. So a self-replicating molecule and a metabolism were the two inventions needed for the very first life forms. But they're not simple inventions. Our DNA is a giant, complex macromolecule, a long double strand made up of millions of smaller, simpler molecules. They themselves built from atoms of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, and many more. The modern metabolism built around this monster molecule is a complex organic factory too, each part finely tuned to a particular function and interdependent on everything else to keep running. Of course, life couldn't start out with something so elaborate. Its beginnings were necessarily much simpler, using basic building blocks that already existed on the early Earth, or that were made for the first time inside its young oceans. So, to find the true beginning, we have to go back and examine the chemical composition of this young world. Of all the possible elements in the universe, 94 occur naturally on our planet. Every element is characterized by its behavior, its affinity for other elements, and the energy needed to make or break connections. Some don't react at all, others, like silicon, react slowly, needing huge amounts of energy to restructure its molecules. Silicon is abundant on the Earth, but not a good candidate for shifting, reactive, biological life. Carbon is a stronger choice. The fourth most common element in the solar system, it can easily form strong bonds with other carbon atoms, as well as with other abundant elements, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen. All life on Earth is based on this cosmopolitan element, combined with oxygen and hydrogen in what are now called organic molecules. In fact, the Hadean Earth was a melting pot of organic opportunity. Sugars, which were destined to become the backbone to our genetic molecules and the fuel for our cellular factories, were made with cosmic chemistry and formed in the star-forming regions of the Milky Way. They floated freely in the early ocean. Nucleobases, too, simple nitrogen-containing compounds that, when combined, form the basis for information storage in our self-replicating molecules. The molecular language of life's instruction manual. A repeating pattern of 4 different nucleobases encodes all the instructions for how to stay alive, grow, and reproduce. On the early Earth, they could have been a spontaneous product of primordial chemistry. Finally, amino acids, also ubiquitous to all life on Earth. They are the building blocks of proteins, from which almost all cellular machinery is shaped. To prove this, back in the 1950s, two American scientists, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, designed a now famous experiment to try and create these amino acids from what they believed the composition of the early atmosphere to be. They started with a mixture of water, methane, ammonia and hydrogen, and ran an electric spark through that mixture. On the early Earth, the same conditions could have been created by a lightning bolt, spearing down from the thunderclouds that capped the first mountains. The result was the creation of entirely new chemicals, including several of the amino acid building blocks that all life on Earth uses. They proved that organic molecules could in fact be made from inorganic matter. So, the building blocks existed as a kind of organic soup in Earth's early oceans. But this, alone, is not life. The molecules must come together in a very specific way to form self-replicating molecules and protein machinery, the key to life. And therein lies the paradox. Today, almost all living things use DNA as their self-replicating molecule. The patterns of nucleobases in the molecule encode all the instructions for growing and reproducing, and making proteins. But of course, to actually do these things, it needs protein machinery to read the instructions, interpret them, and make new components. It needs the hands to do the work. So, proteins are needed to read and reproduce the DNA, but the DNA instructions are needed to make the proteins in the first place. It's the ultimate conundrum, the original chicken and egg. What came first, the proteins or DNA? We are back at the beginning. Our primary problem, the loop, continues. Life begets life yet again. Yet, the true answer is probably neither the DNA or the proteins. Scientists today think that another molecule bridged the gap, the true prototype for the complex machinery that powers our existence, the true beginning of life on Earth. Beneath the churning chaos of Hadean Earth's deep oceans, potentially for the first time, a molecule successfully replicates itself. RNA, as it is known, is a self-replicating single-stranded molecule similar to, but simpler than, DNA. It can replicate, but it can also knot itself up into 3D structures very similar to the protein machinery used in living things today. Scientists believe RNA could have been a catch-all molecule that performed all the functions of early metabolism and replication. The result would have been what scientists call the RNA world, where all of biology is made up of this single-stranded nucleobase pattern. In the prebiotic soup, random combinations of sugars and nucleobases come together and are joined spontaneously by chemical reactions. Some break apart again, but some stay stuck and continue to grow into long strands, one nuclear base after another. Sometimes the strand affects its own structure, coiling or folding back in on itself. In this way, a kind of pre-life natural selection takes hold to select the kinds of molecules that are structurally stable and mechanically useful. The stable strands can act as templates for replication, for making another identical to itself, with the bunched up strands acting as rudimentary machines to help that replication along. A whole ecosystem of different RNA molecules emerges, proliferating and diversifying, more stable strands replicating more successfully, floating freely within the primordial soup. But this, too, is not yet life. The RNA ecosystem alone is a freak of chemistry, not a self-sustaining organism. Any chemical imbalances in the primordial oceans could have collapsed and destroyed the entire RNA world. Even the smallest puddle on the primordial Earth is a big place for a fragile strand of RNA. The chemicals needed for metabolic chemical reactions being impossibly diluted, the chances of them running into each other are vanishingly small. Promising reactions all the while being disrupted by other chemicals floating around in the water. So, for metabolism to really get going, the reactions needed a box to happen in, separated from the outside environment, where chemicals were concentrated and where the RNA could help direct the composition within. All living things rely on these compartments, these boxes. Some make do with just one, others have trillions. Just like the machinery within, the earliest cells probably look very different to today. Modern cells have infinite variety and complexity, but the earliest cells would have been much simpler. But there's a good chance they were made of similar material, called fatty acids. These too would have formed spontaneously from chemical reactions in the prebiotic soup, but it's their interaction with the surrounding water that makes them special. Fatty acids and their molecular relatives have a two-part structure. Part is attracted to water, while the other part is repelled by it. So, what does a fatty acid do when it finds itself immersed in water? It cannot tear itself apart to satisfy both halves of its bipolar nature. Instead, it seeks solace in groups, spontaneously self-organizing into spherical structures that shift the water-hating portions while allowing the water-loving parts to bathe in the soothing rush. Fatty acids may not have been the most abundant molecule on the early Earth, but their spontaneous self-organization makes them promising candidates for the earliest primitive cells. Larger spheres could easily contain strands of replicating RNA, the environment easily isolated and protected. Chemical reactions can happen in this new concentrated internal environment. They can be influenced and directed by the RNA strands, and the changes inside influence the strands themselves. The first tentative metabolisms arise, natural selection of chemical stability, meaning that only those functions that favor cell preservation and perpetuation will stick around. From starborn atoms and molecules concentrated on the young Earth's volatile cells, giant macromolecules form, found ways to reproduce and pass their success on to new generations with survival for sole purpose, improving and walking along the way. Just this one time, life arose spontaneously. Matter begat life, allowing life to beget life for another 3.5 billion years. find out where on earth these first tentative steps of biology took place. We'll explore the controversy around the very first fossils and consider the possibility that life itself may have been delivered from space. You've been watching the entire history of the Earth. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and let us know in the comments what you'd like to see covered in the future. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Just as he pondered the exotic animals he recorded and collected in his voyages through the tropics some 20 years earlier. It was during those years in the early 1830s, spent aboard the illustrious HMS in its 5-year mission to map the coasts of South America, the Lord died 27-year naturalist delivered from waking hour to sound access. Fossils will abound like Barcelona came to from giant land turtles to reptilians, colossal whales, and vast array of seemingly insignificant insects, many of which have never been studied before. Some life forms in the Galapagos Islands in particular, previously largely unexplored by biodiversity, are ever so slight in one another from island to island, hinting at a common ancestor at some point in the past. Now, 20 years after publishing his modestly successful on the verge of releasing a newer, altogether more revolutionary book. One of perhaps the first in great controversy and ultimately success. All this life, all this variety of forms, imagines belongs to a great tree. Like the book that stretches out grasping after the sun. Living species are like the green buds and leaves on the tip of every branch. The branches themselves are once green shoots too, ancestor species of the decaying fruit. Dead now, but a clear path to those we see today. Tracing branches back, they emerge to more primitive ancestors, the foundation of many species yet to come. Ultimately, all the branches go back to the trunk, the ancestral part of the first sapling, the first single exists and has ever existed position in this vast tree line. Each new species to arrive has its own unique limitations, allowing it to branch out on its own. Some flourish, maybe even sprouting successes. Others wither and die. But all are built on the template of the branch in full. At the beginning, long full in the trunk, even began to grow. A simple, the very first ancestor. The very first template in which all living things were built. And when did that first ancestor live? What form did it take? Darwin imagines an early Earth rocky and devoid of life, but on its surface, the warm little pond has just the right chemistry, the building blocks of existence. It's here, he suspects, in these early hills, we can find our first ancestor. Universe and breathtaking diversity years to come, primordial soup, billions of years ago. But that was nearly 160 years ago, and much has been learnt since Darwin's day. Since then, scientists have been reconstructing trees of life in ever more detail, using the characteristics of living and extinct creatures to map the pattern of branches and discover common ancestors, right back to the first. The last universal common ancestor, or LUCA for short, is the ultimate grandfather to everything that came later. All of life on Earth. We now know that life falls into one of three families. All animals, plants, and fungi are eukaryotes, with complex structures inside their cells. Even some single-celled microscopic creatures are eukaryotes too, like amoebas and algae, making do with just one complex cell. Everything else alive is single-celled, but that's not to say that they are less complex. These single cells are aggregate in simple cells, as long as they are adapted. They are adapted to thrive in conditions that no other can stand. Their single cells can survive intensity, cold, saltiness, and acidity. And the densities of this alien world classified as either bacteria or archaea, depending on the chemistry. Because eukaryotes are so much more complex than other bacteria or archaea, scientists place them higher up in the tree. They came later, while the two other families were more primitive. So, LUCA was a single cell. That much is clear. It makes sense too for the earliest ancestor to be among the simplest life possible. But modern science goes further than that. By analysing the DNA of bacteria and archaea, we can build trees of life for these primitive domains too. Instead of looking for shared physical characteristics, researchers look for genes that are in common. In 2016, scientists published a list of 355 genes that were probably part of Luca's DNA, which opens a window on how this first ancestor functioned and the kinds of conditions it could withstand. But the view through that window is surprising. Luca's genes give it the capacity to metabolize hydrogen as a source of energy. They also give it the tools for surviving at extremely high temperatures. This Luca is something unexpected, adapted not to Darwin's warm little pond, but to a much more hostile environment. Able to survive in scorching, acidic waters. In February 1977, a century and a half after the Beagle made its fateful circumnavigation around the Earth, a new generation of scientists in a research vessel off the South American coast made a remarkable discovery. As part of their studies into volcanic activity around Darwin's beloved Galapagos Islands, they dropped cameras down to a depth of more than 2.5 kilometers. When the photos came back, they revealed something entirely unexpected. Instead of lava, hot water poured out of the Galapagos Rift. Towering underwater chimneys emitting plumes of it, darkened by minerals and metals, so it looked like smoke billowing from the sea floor. These scientists were the first to discover Earth's hydrothermal vents, affectionately nicknamed black smokers, bizarre structures that form as seawater penetrates cracks in the crust. Magma close to the surfaces superheats the water to almost 400 degrees Celsius, flash boiling it and spewing it back into the deep ocean like an underwater geyser. On its way, the hot water pulls minerals from the surrounding magma and rock, enriching it into iron, sulfur, hydrogen, ammonia. The minerals in the superheated water build up around the vent, creating alien chimneys in the ocean depths. But there was more. 2.5 kilometers down, no sunlight can penetrate. The darkness is intense, and the pressure is 250 times that at sea level. And yet, around these mysterious black smokers, life was found. Not a few cowering, crushed sea creatures, but vast and blossoming ecosystems. Clams the size of dinner plates, bristling clusters of tube worms, and alien, hairy yeti crabs, all thriving in this curious, hostile microcosm. This entire vent ecosystem relies on another unseen component: single-celled bacteria and archaea, which have the unique ability to convert the chemical energy from the black smoker's complement of minerals into biologically available energy. Food. Elsewhere on Earth, all food chains ultimately come back to the sun. Plants capture the sun's light energy and convert it into sugars, which then support complex food chains of herbivores and carnivores. But on the ocean floor, there is no sun, no light to provide that energy. The single-celled organisms that live here take hydrogen gas or iron sulfide with similar chemicals and use them to power their own metabolisms. The other animals eat them for energy or enslave them within their bodies to produce energy in return for safe harbor. In this way, an entire community is built, based on the abilities of these weird, single-celled organisms, completely unreliant on the sun. And it's these conditions that would have been ideal for Luca, our last common ancestor of all other life. The genes that Luca possessed would have allowed it to survive 400-degree waters. It would have given it all the means to extract energy from hydrogen. It would have given Luca the survival skills for this unimaginable new habitat. At some point in the deep and distant past, it's now thought that our earliest single-celled ancestors clung to vents like these. Our lineage may not have seen the sun for millions of years. But that's not quite the whole story. Although Luca may have been equipped with the tools to survive and thrive on a hydrothermal vent, other clues point to an altogether different kind of beginning for life on Earth. Scientists who study the chemical reactions involved in life's metabolism believe that the ultraviolet light provided by the sun was necessary to get some of those reactions started. Deep beneath the ocean, there's no substitute for that kind of energy, so the earliest life forms must have proliferated when the sun still shone. Once more advanced metabolisms were up and running, life could do without the UV boost, but those earliest reactions were reliant on it. And since chemistry works better when things are concentrated in small volumes of liquid, perhaps Darwin's warm little pond wasn't so far from the true cradle of life after all. But how can these two lines of evidence be reconciled? One points to hellish heat, crushing pressure and acerbic chemistry. The other to sun-baked slime in a much more familiar setting. The key may lie in Luca's true identity. Our last universal common ancestor isn't necessarily the first life form that appeared on the Earth. It is merely the first one whose descendants survived over billions of years to diversify into all living things we see today. So life could indeed have started out in a warm pond, relying on the particular sun-soaked chemistry found there. Perhaps in those early years it had the chance to become well established, and so proliferated, spreading to other warm ponds and larger seas all over the Earth's surface. Everything was going well for global colonization until a catastrophe changed the course of our world forever. For hundreds of millions of years, fire rained from the skies. Thanks to the cosmic dance of giant planets far beyond Earth, asteroids were sent hurtling towards this fragile cradle of life. This bombardment would have vaporized surface water and injected heat and exotic chemicals into the ocean, wreaking havoc on the tentative first life. Only the hardiest variants who could survive this cataclysm remained, driven towards the places in the ocean that avoided the worst of the bombardment. The depths of the deepest oceans, despite darkness and oppressive pressures, became a refuge from the fire and fury on the surface. Here, at least, the water remained. The chemistry stayed the same, and hydrothermal vents became beacons for the single-celled survivors. They provided warmth and chemical energy that these struggling organisms needed to stay alive. Adapting to use hydrogen as a fuel instead of sunlight was the only way to ensure the future of their lineage. Meanwhile, the surface was sterilized. The first life that had gained foothold in warm little ponds on the surface was wiped out instantly. Destined to leave no descendants, its succession stamped out. This was potentially the first great extinction, leaving behind just one weird group of survivors cowering in the depths. How do we know this extinction really happened? With so few rocks and no fossils from this early time, it's certainly hard to be sure about the sagas that gripped Luca and its relations 4 billion years ago. But this is a tale that explains the clues that all living things carry in their cells to this day. And there's one final piece of the puzzle that seems to corroborate our story. The asteroid bombardment eventually tailed off as the solar system settled down, and remaining asteroids were swept up by the planets of the inner solar system. The sterile Earth finally cooled again by about 3.8 billion years ago. But something miraculous followed. Just 100 million years later, the rocks bear a record. The first fossils, physical structures and chemical signatures are locked into rocks that are 3.7 billion years old. These are sophisticated single cells living and dying at the Earth's surface, in little more than a geological blink of the eye after a sterilizing cataclysm. Scientists believe that life like this would have taken many hundreds of millions of years to come about, so there simply wasn't enough time for it to start afresh after the end of the bombardment. Instead, it must have survived the Earth's devastation somehow, hiding away, developing and evolving. As soon as things calmed down, they were primed, ready to burst forth and take over the world. So, hydrothermal vents were most likely the unexpected but essential refuge for our earliest ancestors during the first apocalypse. They were the warm little ponds of that terrible time. They were sanctuary for Luca, a record of that time preserved deep in our collective genetic memory. Darwin was probably right in more ways than he could ever have expected. Next time, we'll discover the devastating but life-giving convulsions of the first plate tectonics and explore an alternative, altogether more alien explanation for the origins of life on Earth. You've been watching the entire history of the Earth. Don't forget to like and subscribe and let us know what you think in the comments. And we'll see you next week. First half of the year 1812, Mount Tambora began to rumble. The immense mountain had towered mutely over the Indonesian archipelago for centuries, an entire culture growing and prospering at its base, with trading links as far as Cambodia and Vietnam. Nearly 2,000 miles away, on the distant island of Sumatra, Sir Stamford Raffles, the future founder of Singapore, was stationed. On the 5th of April 1815, he reported the sounds of distant gunshots, and troops were moved to counter the supposed military threat. He struggled to sleep that night, the mysterious cannons still echoing in the distance and keeping him from his slumber. The next day, however, the true cause of the blasts was revealed. A thin layer of ash began to descend from the darkening skies. Over the next few days, the heavens blackened further still, and the atmosphere became stuffy and close, as if before a great storm. And on the evening of the 10th of April, 1815, 1,600 miles away, Mount Tambora exploded. This was an eruption, the likes of which had never before been seen by human eyes, nor has ever been seen since. The mountain became a flowing mass of liquid fire, with columns of flame reaching high into the air. As the core of the volcano collapsed, it blew itself apart. Semi-molten volcanic bombs the size of coconuts rained from the heavens. Scorching, racing, pyroclastic flows cascaded down the mountainside, wiping village of Tambora off the map. 10,000 people were killed and another 35,000 left homeless. The entire culture and language of the Tambora people was erased in days. The eruption tore the top of the mountain overnight. When the sun rose, Mount Tambora was 1.5 kilometers shorter than the day before, with a caldera more than 6 kilometers across. But the sun didn't shine over Indonesia that day, or for many days after. Stamford Raffles reported taking his breakfast by candlelight, the volcano disgorging 100 cubic kilometers of rock and ash, which filled the air and darkened the skies. His ash and noxious gases lofted high into the atmosphere. They were spread around the globe on jet streams. All over the planet, the sun's light was blocked. A veil seemed to cover the sky. Global temperature dropped by 3 degrees Celsius. Crops failed, and over the following year, disease and famine killed as many as 80,000 people. As far away as Europe, the snow fell in June, and 1816 became known as the year without a summer. The climate-altering blanket immortalized the dramatically coloured sunsets of Turner's romantic landscapes. The Tambora eruption of 1815 was the largest and most destructive volcanic eruption in recorded history. Its effects were catastrophic not only to humans, but to the local ecosystem and global climate too. Natural catastrophes like this are an inevitable consequence of the global process of plate tectonics. But plate tectonics itself is shrouded in mystery. What powers it? When did it start? And how important really is it? It turns out In the years following this brutal eruption, scientists discovered that as terrible and destructive as its consequences may be, plate tectonics could be the key to keeping Earth alive. At the time of the Great Tambora eruption, geologists were still striving to understand how the surface of our planet really worked. What created its mountains and ocean basins? What caused the natural disasters? If not, the wrath of the gods. The belief was that the surface of the Earth was a single, solid shell of rock. Yet nonetheless, there were clues hinting at colossal, invisible processes that shaped that shell. In the 16th century, it was Dutch cartographers who first noticed the curious shapes of our continents, shaped in such a way as to fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, despite being separated by great swathes of ocean. Assuming they were once joined, how did these great fragments of rock become separated? The favoured theory of the time was that of thermal cycles. Occasionally, scientists reasoned the Earth heated up, and as warm objects tend to expand, so the Earth expanded, cracking the crust and separating the continents. But in 1915, Alfred Wegener, a German meteorologist, proposed a new theory. Instead of thermal cycles separating continents, land masses wandered around the Earth like immense icebreaker ships ploughing through the Arctic basins. Wegener's ideas were groundbreaking and supported by a slew of new evidence. Not only the previously seen jigsaw coastlines, but also the discovery of fossils of similar creatures found on continents oceans away. Indeed, when Robert Scott had made his doomed expedition to the Arctic several years earlier, he and his men had found the fossils of tropical rainforest beneath tundra and frozen rock. It was clear that the continents had not only been separated, but had also drifted from the equator to the poles. Fittingly, Wegener's theory became known as continental drift. But there was a problem. Despite the evidence that it had indeed happened, Wegener offered no explanation how it came about. What forces move entire continents? And how did they make their way through the solid rock of the ocean floor without breaking themselves up in the process? Eventually, Wegener's ideas of continental drift lost favour, but a seed had been sown for an entirely new theory, one which took the cutting edge of 20th century geophysics to realise. In the 1960s, a global network of seismometers was established for the first time, capable of pinpointing the epicenters of deadly earthquakes. And they revealed something surprising. Earthquakes didn't happen randomly all over the Earth's surface. They were confined to narrow strips crisscrossing the globe. Sometimes these strips followed the edges of continents, and sometimes they cut right through the centres of the oceans. Together, these earthquake-prone areas defined the boundaries of more stable slabs of rock. Those slabs are what we now know as plates, with the earthquakes concentrated at plate boundaries where they grind and crash against one another. New techniques to find the ages of rocks and the orientation of their formation added data to this new understanding of is a deceptively simple one. The rocks of the crust have lost some of their heavier minerals, so they're less dense than the mantle underneath. So, they float on top like rafts of ice on an Arctic lake. Continental rocks even more processed than those in the oceans, and therefore even more buoyant. They can build up to huge heights and still stay afloat, like towering icebergs. So, the surface of the Earth is covered with these rock rafts, bumping and jostling for dominance. But they do more than that. The plates are constantly moving, shifting, transforming. Where two plates separate, magma rises to fill the gap, hardening to create brand new rock, adding to the diverging plates on either side of the boundary. But growth of the plate can't go unchecked. Where the two plates meet and press against each other, the rocks are crumbling, folding and breaking them into tortured, gargantuan heaps, like the Himalayas, the highest peaks of our
You're just
world.
making it harder on yourself by doing such a great job. Now they want you to blaze a route from the Highland base to the transit point. Your performance does make me look better, though. So, keep it up, and please, be careful.
But eventually, one planet triumphs in this planetary struggle. It's density that decides the winner, as one rock raft will inevitably be marginally more buoyant than the other. The lighter rocks stand their ground at the surface, while the heavier crust is forced down, bending, subducting into the mantle. As the heavier rock descends, it's heated and melts, releasing its minerals and water. That melt creates huge volumes of magma, enough to feed explosive volcanoes, like the mighty Mount Titanfall. As geologists study the surface of the planet in ever more detail, all evidence seems to point to this slow war of growth and destruction taking place over geological timescales. But it's still not clear what powers this movement. Just as Wegener couldn't explain how continental drift worked, scientists today are still struggling to pinpoint the mechanisms driving plate tectonics and how they got started. And the constant recycling of rock means that, by its very nature, the process of plate tectonics masks its own history. The core of our world is immensely hot, remnant of its violent formation and the decay of radioactive elements in the center. That core is like a hot plate being pumped by water, delivering its heat into the fluid rock above. Warmer mantles rise, spread out, cool, and sink back down, creating huge sideways currents beneath the crust, pushing it along. But to truly understand what powers plate tectonics, we need to look back to its very beginnings. When the Earth formed some 4.5 billion years ago, and in the early Hadean Eon followed, nothing like modern plate tectonics could have existed. The rocks were too hot, too thoroughly mixed by the convulsions of the still forming, battered Earth. The outer surface of the planet froze into a single solid shell, while the interior remained hot and molten. So instead of plate tectonics, a very different regime must have reigned. Although the crust remained stubborn on the surface, the heat from the mantle still strove to escape. It warmed the base of that crust and became hotter and hotter until that solid shell began to melt at its base. Gradually, this molten rock dripped down into the mountain. There it collects and is superheated until it's hotter, with little enough density to come back up. Plumes of magma rising up through the mantle, punching through the crust, forging the very first volcanoes. So instead of the circulating currents of modern-day plate tectonics, the early motion was almost entirely vertical, up and down, rather than what we have today. Though vertical plumes are still somewhat seen in our present, the Hawaiian Islands form part of a chain of volcanoes formed by a plume of magma that has remained in place for 18 million years. But plate tectonics is now much more dominant than this unknown volcanism. So at some point in the last 4 billion years, the Earth's tectonic regime transformed. How they happen, however, is still something of a mystery. Scientists' best guess is that as the Earth cooled, the compositions and temperatures of the mantle and crust gradually changed. The crust became weaker, fragmenting into small rafts, the precursor to the modern plates. If the edge of one plate dipped below another, subduction could begin, dragging the rest of the raft after it. With the advent of subduction, the heat transfer in the mantle was given a horizontal component for the first time. Convection currents were established, which helped the sideways movement of plates, making the process self-sustaining. Plate tectonics was born. Though we might take it for granted, it seems like this ongoing tectonic process is actually very rare in the cosmos. And we know for our very existence. It's other nearby planets might have geological activity, volcanoes and earthquakes. Their sources are mainly sun plate tectonics, and other nearby planets are, as far as we know, devoid of life. Perhaps it's not such a coincidence that both life and plate tectonics are unique phenomena to our world. Because the cycling of rock through the Earth's surface also has an important impact on another cycle, critical to life, the carbon cycle. Life is made of organic carbon compounds, but it also relies on inorganic carbon compounds like carbon dioxide to keep the planet's temperature at a habitable level, trapping the heat of the sun within the atmosphere like an insulating blanket. And carbon dioxide is expelled from volcanoes when they erupt. Extra carbon dioxide pumped into the atmosphere thickens the warming blanket and increases global temperatures. But some of the carbon dioxide in the air dissolves in the water droplets of clouds, and before long rains out into rivers, lakes and oceans all over the globe. There it reacts with rocks, breaking them down and making new ones, carbonates like limestone. Much of the carbon dioxide spewed out by volcanoes ends up trapped again, locked up in the sedimentary rocks of its crust. But plate tectonics hasn't weakened this carbon stream. As the plates are consumed, converging boundaries, the sedimentary rocks are also subducted. They melt and release carbon dioxide back into the magma to erupt from volcanoes once again. In this way, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere reach an equilibrium, providing an environment that's not too hot and not too cold for life to thrive. Without it, we can easily end up like one of our barren, inhospitable planetary neighbors, a dead world floating through the void. Venus, with plenty of volcanoes but no tectonic recycling, witnessed the uncontrollable release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere early in its existence. The sun was locked away. When no further reactions could take place, levels of the greenhouse gas continued to build. Oceans evaporated, and the rocks themselves altered to release carbon back into the atmosphere. Runaway heating led to Venus becoming the hottest planet in our solar system, its surface more than 450 degrees Celsius. Without plate tectonics, the planet baked to death. Mars, on the other hand, suffered a different but equally terminal fate. The red planet is smaller than the Earth, so cooled quicker. There's evidence for volcanic activity on the surface, but this has slowed as the planet aged. Less and less carbon dioxide was released into its atmosphere, and what was already there was gradually locked away in its rocks or blown away by the solar winds. Without a way to recycle the carbon stores, Mars was stripped of its insulating blanket and left out in the cold. Without plate tectonics, the planet froze to death. So, the recycling of carbon through the Earth's surface helped to maintain a temperature just right for life to get started and thrive. And plate tectonics probably offered other benefits to a young Earth and its tentative first life forms too. The twisting and shifting of plates across the Earth's surface created diverse environments and niches for life to exploit. Among these were hydrothermal vents, which form around the diverging boundaries in the middle of oceans. It was around vents like these that our last common ancestor found refuge while the Earth was bombarded with meteors for the Earth. So, even though volcanic events like the catastrophic 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora have the capacity to wreak havoc on local ecosystems and global climate, they are an essential part of a wider process that is keeping our planet alive. In this way, plate tectonics could just be the key to making a planet habitable. Next time, we'll investigate an altogether more alien explanation for life on Earth. We'll look at the earliest fossils ever found on our world, and we'll investigate what could have happened had life never evolved on our planet. You've been watching the entire history of the Earth. Don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram to keep up to date with the amazing artwork produced for the show. And we'll see you next time.